The crystalline surface of Viridia Prime didn't just shine. It vibrated with a low, melodic hum that Kalen Voss felt in the marrow of his bones. As a peacekeeper of the Soul Terran Accord, he was trained to ignore the sensory overload of alien worlds, yet the glass spire loomed over the diplomatic plaza like a jagged needle of pure light. He adjusted the seal on his formal duty tunic, his fingers brushing the cold fabric. Stoicism was his armor, a necessary weight in a sector where one wrong look could ignite a century of holy war. He wasn't here for the scenery. He was here because the Highborn were teetering on the edge of a succession crisis that threatened to spill into human space. Matriarch Solari awaited him at the apex of the spire, her presence a tectonic force in the local political landscape. "She isn't my type, Your Majesty," Kalen said, his voice flat and echoing against the translucent walls of the throne room. Matriarch Solari's eyes, swirling nebulae of violet and gold, narrowed as she gestured toward the figure standing in the shadow of a glowing archway. This was Zilia. She didn't walk so much as displaced the air around her, her skin shimmering with the same bioluminescence as the planet's flora. She was the embodiment of Viridian tradition, a living relic of a culture that viewed emotional influence as a biological right. To the Highborn, the rejection of a princess was not a mere social blunder. In the shadow of the glass spire, a rejection is a declaration of war. Kalen felt the shift in the room immediately. The air grew heavy, charged with the static of Xylia's mounting offense. He knew the protocols, he knew the risks, but he also knew that any hint of submission to her ethereal influence would compromise the neutrality of his mission. Later that evening, Kalen sat alone in the mess hall of the diplomatic quarters, staring into a cup of lukewarm coffee. The liquid was bitter and stagnant, a mundane reminder of the gray, utilitarian life he led back on Earth. It was a stark contrast to the overwhelming brilliance of Viridia. He swirled the dark liquid, watching the reflection of the crystalline moon dance on the surface. A chime at the door broke his focus. It wasn't a servant. It was a formal challenge, etched onto a shard of singing glass. Zilia had called for a trial by combat in the mountain arena. The trek to the arena was a blur of jagged peaks and thin, perfumed air. Thousands of Highborn had gathered, their collective psychic hum creating a pressure that made Kalen's temples throb. He stepped into the center of the bioluminescent circle, his boots crunching on the glowing sand. Zilia stood opposite him, a blade of pure plasma forming in her hand, her eyes locked onto his with a predatory intensity, which meant the diplomatic talks were officially over. The duel began not with a strike, but with a surge of energy that knocked the wind from Kalen's lungs. Zilia moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, her blade whistling through the air. Kalen parried, his combat knife sparking against her energy weapon. He realized quickly that she wasn't aiming for his vitals. She was testing his boundaries, pushing against his mental fortress to see where it would crack. How long had she been waiting for someone to push back? And then, he saw the opening. Not an opening to kill, but an opening to end the spectacle. Kalen Voss dropped his rifle and raised his hands in the center of the bioluminescent arena, surrendering to Xylia's glowing plasma blade as thousands of Highborn screamed for his blood. The blade stopped inches from his throat. The heat from the plasma singed his skin, but he didn't flinch. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, the psychic pressure in the arena vanished, replaced by a stunned, ringing silence. Zilia lowered her weapon, the plasma dissipating into a faint, ozone-scented mist. She looked at Kalen, not with the triumph of a victor, but with the quiet calculation of a scientist who had finally found the correct variable. He had chosen vulnerability over violence. In the Highborn's rigid social architecture, that choice was a seismic shift. But there was no time for a peaceful aftermath. The sky above the mountain arena didn't just darken, it tore. A fleet of hollow scythe ships, massive, organic mechanical nightmares that looked like bleached ribs woven with obsidian ripped through hyperspace, They were the sector's great silence, an ancient swarm that didn't conquer so much as assimilate everything in its path. Chaos erupted. High-born nobles scrambled for their shuttles as the first beams of kinetic energy struck the glass spire in the distance. Kalen reached out, his hand closing around Xylia's wrist. It was the first time he had touched her without a weapon between them. Her skin was fever-hot, vibrating with the sudden frantic pulse of the planet's distress. "The Vanguard," Kalen shouted over the roar of atmospheric entry. "If we don't reach the reactor, they'll use the ship's warp core as a battery for the hive." To risk the SS Vanguard as the corridors began to buckle. The ship was a labyrinth of fire and screaming metal. On the bridge, human security forces were locked in a desperate, losing battle with internal saboteurs drones that had bypassed the hull through phased matter shifts. Xylia didn't wait for orders. She stepped toward the exposed reactor core, her hands weaving through the air as if pulling invisible threads. This was the science of her people, the manipulation of subatomic resonance. By aligning her own bioelectric field with the ship's leaking energy, she began to stitch the containment fields back together. Kalen stood at the bulkhead, his back to her. He was a wall of lead and intent. Every time a drone hissed through the vents, he met it with the brutal, efficient violence of a man who had nothing left to lose but the woman behind him. He took a hit to the shoulder, the searing pain of a needle shot barely registering. "Almost done," Xylia gasped. The reactor stabilized with a thrum that shook the deck plating. The sudden surge of corrected energy backfired through the holosite's link, short-circuiting their boarding craft. In that moment of shared desperation, the soldier and the princess had done what a millennium of diplomats could not. They had become a single mechanism of survival. Years later, the mountain arena was no longer a place of blood. It was a garden. Kalen sat on a stone bench, watching a group of children play near the bioluminescent pools. They moved with a grace that was not quite human, and a laughter that was entirely so. He looked down at the cup in his hand. It was the same ceramic mug from the mess hall, chipped and stained, but the liquid inside was no longer lukewarm or bitter. It was sweet, brewed from viridian tea leaves. He took a sip, the warmth spreading through him as Xylia sat by his side, her hand resting over his. The coffee was long gone, replaced by a life he never thought he'd earn. Which makes me wonder, if you were forced to choose between your oldest traditions and the person who challenged them, which one would you let burn? Join us tomorrow as we venture deeper into the sectors where the old rules no longer apply.